Okay, today we're at the Children's Justice Center talking with Ken Dicken, who is a horticulturalist, comes from the Lake Chelan area of Washington. He's a master apple grower, and he's come to answer some questions that have come up with regard to our fundraiser where we provide apples to the community. So Ken, today we'd like to take some time and ask you these questions. Give us some of your background and how you came to be a master apple grower.
You bet. I appreciate the opportunity, by the way, because I've always been intrigued because of having grown up in the apple industry all my life. I always get surprised when people ask me questions because to me it might be more common sense, and so I think, well, they'll know the answer. For example, one lady asked me one time, well, I don't want to buy apples at this time because it's past the picking date, and so they won't be fresh, and so they'll freeze in the wintertime. You know, questions like that. And when we talk about that, say, well, no, they're put in a controlled atmosphere, refrigerated container, and they're shipped 365 days a year, and so everything is handled and appropriate. And so answering questions like this and having this opportunity, I think is very beneficial and worthwhile. And so thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
As far as my background is concerned, I've been growing apples for 40 years. And so it all began when my father, who was an engineer for Boeing's in Seattle, Washington, kind of got tired of the rat race, and so he retired out of that and bought a farm in eastern Washington. And so when I was about 9 years old, I had my first experience with growing apples on a farm, and so I loved it. It was great, and I had a wonderful opportunity to work side by side with my dad and my brothers in the orchards. And so 9 years old is when I got started in this, and I've been growing apples ever since then. And so I've done a lot with managing orchards and growing orchards. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had a real estate developer come to me, and he was buying up orchards that were run down and dilapidated, and he was buying up orchards in the valley that I lived in. And so as it turned out, he wanted me to manage the orchards that he was buying. And so when I was a sophomore in high school, and then of course a junior and then a senior for 3 years, I had a great opportunity to take over these orchards and do everything from A to Z in the whole orchard project. And so by the time I was a senior, I was managing almost 50 acres when I was in high school.
My goodness, was it a year-round job doing?
Yeah. Yeah, so prune in the winter time, and at harvest time, the teachers would cringe when they'd see me coming because I'd have my paper and I would be requesting my homework in advance because I would take 3 weeks or more off during harvest time to pick apples and run picking crews and take care of all the operations of the orchard. And so, but it was a good experience. And as it turned out, I was involved with the FFA program, Future Farmers of America, and I had the opportunity to apply for one of their awards and won that in 1978, the Star Agribusinessman Award of the Year for the state of Washington in the FFA program. And so that was a nice treat to be able to be involved, and that was on account of managing these orchards in the high school years that I grew up in. So
experience from a young age.
And then since then, I had lots of opportunities. I've managed 1,000 acres here in Utah, for example. Managed 1,500 acres in Washington, and of course I have other projects along the way. So.
How many trees are in 1,500 acres?
Just short of 1 million.
Oh my! How do you prune 1 million trees?
Yeah, lots of help. Lots of help. You don't do it yourself.
Yeah.
A lot of people to incorporate and bring in as a team, and we worked well together as a team, and had a lot of fun doing it. So a lot of hard work, but we had a good time doing it.
Well, what makes Lake Chelan, is that the correct?
Lake Chelan, yes.
What makes it such an optimal area for growing apples?
That's a great question, because a lot of times when people think about growing apples, they think in terms of, well, Washington State is a great place to grow apples in general, and you hear of other places around the world that that's the case. And you'll find also that within the state, while that's true, there are specific locations that are better than most. And so Lake Chelan has a great combination of altitude and a great combination of soil and water availability, as well as warm temperatures in the daytime at harvest time, and then the combination of that with cool temperatures in the evening. And that contrast has a great deal to do with the eatability and the taste of an apple. It brings on the sugar, converts that starch to sugar in a nice way. I've grown apples in other regions and areas where you'll find that it stays warm during the day, and then in the evening at harvest time, it doesn't cool off. You don't get that difference in temperature. Mm-hmm. And we find that that has a great effect on the color of the apple, has a great effect on the pressure of the apple. You know, is it going to eat soft and mealy, or is it going to eat firm and crisp? And it also has a great effect on the sugar in the apple, which affects, of course, eatability. So it has a great influence on it.
Now, we were going to ask the question about where else in the world apples grow well, but in conjunction with that, I know one variety of apple is called a Fuji apple. Does that mean apples grow well in Japan?
Obviously, which is where the Fuji apple originated from. And so that's a great region, obviously, and they do a great job of growing the Fuji in Japan. In fact, you'll find they grow huge Fuji apples in Japan, and they'll treat it like a meal. They'll bring a big apple, and that will become the center piece of the meal. They'll take a knife and slice it up, and everybody will eat slices of the one apple. And so you'll find that the Fujis can grow to be an enormous size, and they manicure those apples immaculately. They just groom it. They'll thin leaves on the tree, and they'll cover the apple, and they'll protect it, and they'll do different things to it to make a great tasting apple. And we don't have the economy in place to do that here. It's more for mass production, what we grow in Washington State. But you'll find that there are areas in the world that do well at growing particular varieties, and the Fuji's is a good example. Other areas around the world do grow apples, obviously, clear across the United States, Chile, New Zealand, Holland. There are great growing districts around the world, but we're finding that this particular area where we obtain these apples from are just, the elevation, like I talked before, the elevation, the characteristics of the growing region are just superior. And you can go 30 miles down the road or 50 miles down the road and have it be a completely different scenario, and you'll get a different effect and a different tasting apple. So it does make a difference.
Cool, okay. So tell us how apples ripen. I mean, what's the whole process? When does the season start? How do they grow? And then how do they ripen?
Right. Most people may not realize this, but apples begin their cycle, obviously, very early on in the season. And when that tree first throws out its blooms, we'll look for the king bloom. You'll have a cluster of blooms, and the first one that comes out in the center one is called the king bloom. And when that bloom gets to about 3/4 of the way out across the tree, we call that full bloom for that tree or that orchard. And so we can pick that date on a calendar when that occurs. And then we'll measure out and look at the calendar and say, okay, depending upon the variety, so many days from full bloom is when that apple should be ripe. So that's one of the factors that we look at. For example, a red delicious apple may be 125 or 130 days from full bloom. But you'll also find that a Fuji, which is a late season apple, may be 189 days, for example, from full bloom approximately. So we'll look at that as a guide. If you look at the whole picture from that growing angle, you'll see that there's a lot of influences throughout the growing season that come into factor. You know, the weather, how hot is it throughout the season, how much moisture is there a lot of rain during that season, what is your irrigation cycle, are your trees in a drought condition, for example, because you don't have the water to take care of them adequately. That affects the taste and when the apples are going to come on. There's a lot of factors that come into that. But what happens towards the end, and as we get to harvest, then we're looking for sugar in the apple, of course, and how firm is it. We're looking for color. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play. But when we get to that harvest window, we're going to do several tests and several measurements, and maybe if we have time, we'll talk about that later. But it's a very interesting thing in a cycle when it comes to testing when that apple is actually mature.
Do they continue to ripen after you've picked them, like tomatoes or other?
No, they don't. And you'll find that is an actual misconception people have. They figure, okay, because I picked this apple now it will just continue to sweeten, and what happens is once you pick it, you're cutting off the nutrient supply from the tree. And after it's picked, now this apple is separate and individual. It's not receiving nutrients from the tree anymore. And so it actually begins to immediately die. It begins to decay. And so it's a race against time now, because we have to do things to try to protect that apple from dying or slow down, its death rate basically, and so its decay rate. So as it turns out, there are several things we can do with that in mind. But an apple really doesn't get sweeter. It might seem like in certain situations, but the reality is that you're not going to get a sweeter apple after you pick it.
Okay, so this last year we had some questions come up, and it made us want to ask the question, how do you know when the apple is really ripe? Is there a test that you do for sweetness? What makes the farmer say, this is the time to pick?
Yeah, that's another good point. There's a lot of factors that go into whether or not that apple is actually ready for picking. And one of those factors is, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at that bloom, days from full bloom window. How many days is it? So we're looking at a particular date on the calendar, for one. Another factor, which is my favorite, is go out in the field and at the orchard, pick that apple off the tree and taste it. Okay, how does it taste? Is it snappy? Does it taste right? There's enough sugar there? So that's the best way, because as a consumer, and I am a consumer also, I want to make sure that apple is a good eating experience. And so if I take it off the tree and it's too tart, it's not ready to be picked, I can tell that it's too dense, which you can have that case, then it's not ready to be picked. But there are several other tests as well. One is what we call a starch iodine test. And we'll take the apple, we'll cut it in half, and we'll with a spray bottle squirt iodine on the center, and we'll wait a little bit, and the starch mixture in the apple and the iodine will absorb or not absorb into that area, the core of the apple. And so we compare that with a series of pictures of progression from years of research that have gone on in the past, and we'll say, okay, that apple is not ready yet because the iodine is not being absorbed into that starchy area yet. And so that's a starch iodine test, and we can look that way at the apple, that condition. Another one is called a pressure test, and we take an apple. In fact, I have an apple here. We'll take an apple and we'll cut 3 different sections off the apple, and then we have a pressure gauge. Almost looks like a tire gauge for your car, but it's a round dial instrument, and we press that into the apple, and it measures the pounds per square inch that it takes to penetrate that apple. So now we're getting an actual number that we can say, okay, here's the pounds pressure for this apple. And there are standards in the industry that we need to go by, and as a result, we can tell the pounds of pressure that apple is going to give us in terms of eating experience and storage ability. So that apple, we know, will store longer in storage and keep longer and not break down if it goes into storage as a firm apple. If we wait too long in the field to pick that because it's gotten too soft, then that apple will not last in storage. Another test is what we call a Brix test, and we're testing for sugar. And what that is it's kind of looks like a small telescope, and you look through it one eye, and on the one end, it's called a refractometer or a refractometer. And you take a wedge out of the apple so that you get a cross section of the apple from top to bottom into the center, and you squeeze that on the instrument. Just put a few drops of that apple juice basically on the refractometer and slide the little lens down over it, and then look. And inside it will give you a measurement, a numbered measurement of what the sugar level is in that apple. And it's an amazing device, but very simple to use, and anybody can do it in their backyard if they have one of these. And so what that's telling us is the percent of sugar in the apple. And there's a range, so we say, okay, if it's below 9, that means there's not as much sugar in there, and so we want to wait until we get at least a 9. Or if it's up as high as 18 or higher, that's a very sweet apple. And so we can look in terms of numerically and measure that so that we can tell, okay, is the sugar right in the apple as well. We're also looking for color and size and other factors as well. So there's a lot of factors